Great. Good morning, everyone. At least on the East Coast of the United States, it's morning. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center at the College of the Holy Cross and the founder of an initiative called Catholics and Cultures. And it's been our purpose to help foster the study of Catholicism in many cultures around the world, both through all online resources, actually, both through our Catholics and Cultures website, which is a kind of introductory level website, which we hope has scholarly insight and is great for teaching, and through the Journal of Global Catholicism with Mathew Schmalz as the editor and Mark Listow as the managing editor. So one of the things we're happy to expand to do is these author meets critics sessions where we get to talk about books that are influential in terms of the study of global Catholicism. And today we get to hear about a book from an author who's been very generous and very helpful to all of us in the field. So I'm going to turn it over to Mathew Schmalz to do the introductions and thank everyone for being here.
Okay. Thank you, Tom, and thank you all for being with us. And so I'd like to welcome each and every one of you and thank you for taking the time to be involved in what I sure will be a wonderful discussion of a wonderful monograph. As Tom said, I'm Mathew Schmalz, editor-in-chief of the Journal of Global Catholicism, and it's my great pleasure to welcome the participants in our Authors Meets Critics session today on Simon Coleman's Powers of Pilgrimage, Religion in a World of Movement. And I should note initially that all our participants are particularly distinguished, and so my general comments in no way will do them justice, unfortunately. So Simon Coleman is Chancellor Jackman Professor at the University of Toronto. And before coming to the University of Toronto, he was at the University of Sussex, where he had been head of the Department of Anthropology. And prior to that, he had been Reader in Anthropology at the University of Durham and Deputy Dean of Faculty of the Social Sciences and Health. And he obtained his undergraduate degree and PhD from Cambridge University. Simon was president of the Society for Social Anthropology of Religion, and he is currently co-editor of the Journal of Religion and Society, Advances in Research, and of the book series from Routledge, Studies in Pilgrimage, Religious Travel and Tourism. And formerly, he was editor of the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute. So welcome, Simon, and it's going to be a great pleasure to discuss your book. Then in alphabetical order, I'd like to introduce our participants, our kind and gentle and admiring critics. John Eade is Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Roehampton. He's also Research Fellow of the Department of the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto and co-founder of the Routledge series, Religion, Travel, and Tourism. Lena Gemzoe is an anthropologist and associate professor of gender studies at Stockholm University, Sweden, and author of Feminine Matters, Women's Religious Practices in a Portuguese Town. Mario Katic is associate professor and faculty member at the University of Zadar in Croatia in the Department of Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology. And among his many publications are Approaching Pilgrimage, Methodological Issues Involved in Researching Roots, Sites, and Practices, and Military Pilgrimage and Battlefield Tourism, Commemorating the Dead. And both of these are edited with John Eade, who is another one of our participants. So welcome and our gratitude to you all. So our plan today will be to first have Simon Coleman make some brief comments on his Powers of Pilgrimage to frame our discussion. Then I'll invite each of our panelists to comment, and then finally return to Simon for comments and a response, and then open things up to all of us in the audience to discuss this particularly rich examination of pilgrimage and what religion looks like in movement. So I'd like to turn things over then to Simon and ask him to make some brief comments about the book, its genesis, and its theoretical thrust.
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank everybody who's here. Certainly Tom for initially extending the invitation to me for this Author Meets Critics session, Matt for acting as moderator, and Lena, Mario, and John for being, I think, what you call gentle critics, Matt. So we'll see. And I'm also delighted to continue what I see as an association with the Journal of Global Catholicism, and also actually a connection with Mark Lustow, whom I think I first met at a American Anthropological Association meeting way back in the mists of time. I can't quite remember when, but he may. But I had the opportunity to say a few words about Powers of Pilgrimage. And I should actually say that the genesis of the book really began in an email invitation to me from Jennifer Hammer at NYU Press to write a general textbook on pilgrimage. Gradually, actually, that book, of course, developed into something very different. Still a kind of overview of pilgrimage, but one with much more theoretical ambition, and one that I wanted very self-consciously to contain dialogues between different ethnographic case studies of pilgrimage, both Christian and non-Christian. And I wanted to include my own work on Walsingham, as well as English cathedrals, as a kind of set of ethnographic threads running throughout the book. So Powers of Pilgrimage became a kind of extended reflection on pilgrimage as an activity, but also as a field. And I began to ask what it means to actually go on pilgrimage in the contemporary world, but also what it means to construct a field of study, pilgrimage studies, in other words, that can remain a vibrant, shifting, and especially an outward-looking conversation. Now, like all conversations, I'm trying to create dialogues in the book, these threads of discussion that I hope appear and reappear throughout the chapters, and which also touch on each other at various points. And I'm just going to kind of mention three main themes there, or dialogues. One dialogue is obviously with past studies of pilgrimage. For instance, most obviously, I guess, with Victor and Eade Turner, who did so much to develop the field in the 1970s, but who I argue actually have often been read in rather partial ways that don't take into account the background of what they're actually saying, or indeed all that they say in image and pilgrimage. And in many ways, I therefore placed them in dialogue less with, say, Eliade or even Van Gennep, but actually with the cultural studies scholar Stuart Hall for much of the book. Trying to develop, therefore, an analytical lexicon that isn't just about, say, liminality in the sacred, but also a lexicon that considers such terms as laterality, articulation, entrainment, that I develop in the book. All dimensions of pilgrimage that in some sense take us back to pilgrimage and what we might call everyday life. And then there's a dialogue with John Eade and Mike Salno's work as they remake much of the field, certainly in anthropology in the 1980s. And more recently, I've become interested in how images of the Camino have in many ways taken over the popular as well as the scholarly imagination, or at least many scholarly imaginations of what a pilgrimage should be, at least in much Euro-American work. Now, much of the work that I've just mentioned there, I think, contains the characteristic tropes, especially of an Anglophone field, and a field that is also Christian and has been Christian in many of its concerns. So I also ask in this book, and I try and query some of the Christian assumptions that have driven much of that Anglophone contribution to what we now call pilgrimage studies. But the book also contains, secondly, dialogues with other subfields. So my own career has itself been a kind of dialogue between the study of Pentecostalism and the study of pilgrimage. And that grew into a kind of intellectual question about what I see as the analytical fate of pilgrimage and Pentecostalism, especially in the fields that I've encountered within what's broadly called the anthropology of Christianity. Broadly and crudely put, you can see pilgrimage as often having been depicted as if you like fleeing from the world, Pentecostalism as taking over the world. And that's also played out, I argue, in certain kinds of theoretical orientations. In many ways, I think the enclaving of a lot of pilgrimage theory in anthropology, and yet as opposed to the encompassing of large parts of the anthropology of Christianity by students of Pentecostalism. So really, I start the book with these two fields, scholarly fields, kind of metaphorically shouting at each other. The enclavers on the one side and the encompassers on the other. And then by the end of the book, what I hope to have shown is that proper dialogue actually can begin between pilgrimage and Pentecostalism as practices, but also as fields of study and indeed as forms of religion in motion. Thirdly, and finally, there's a dialogue with the anthropology of ritual. studying pilgrimage leads me not just to the so-called sacred centers out there, to people being overtly religious, but also to pilgrimage in what I describe as penumbral spaces and situations that surround shrine cores. Pilgrimage not necessarily confined to liminal spaces and liminal times, but also manifested in those lateral contexts where people are half caught in and by ritual. So I ask what it means to participate not just in, but also around or adjacent to a ritual, or in relation to the distant memory of having participated in one. And I use this example, for instance, of these two boys who visit Durham Cathedral with their father and lighting candles in the long shadows cast by a saint's tomb, uncertain themselves whether they're commemorating a saint or past birthday parties, or maybe a beloved grandmother. Or going beyond Christianity, I ask about how we think about the Hajj, not as it's practiced at Mecca, but drawing on the work of Kholoud al-Ajama as it's manifested in popular pilgrimage songs that seep deep into the lives of Moroccan citizens. Now, this approach then partly leads into debates about religion and the everyday, but also, I think, to some degree, into those pilgrimage and tourism debates, not really trying to look at that old question of whether something is or isn't pilgrimage or isn't tourism, but really, I think the ways in which tourism, or heritage tourism to shrines especially, might involve encounters with objects, activities, and rituals that may have unexpected resonances, particular kind of ritual kindlings in people's lives. So tourism ritual to shrines is almost productive as forms of semiotic and spiritual risk, even for those who identify themselves as being secular. Now, reflecting on all these dialogues throughout the chapters leads me finally in the book to the chapter, the conclusions that really goes back to the idea of restoring the powers of pilgrimage, restoring those powers as both activity and academic pursuit, coming to see pilgrimage at, but not confined to, special places or times, uncovering articulations with multiple other spaces, times, and socialities, and looking at pilgrimage activities understood, for instance, through political economy, debates about migration and refugeehood, looking not just at remote mountainsides, but urban centers of Chicago or Lagos, perceived through the lenses of piety or spirituality, but also through troubled forms of kinship and ambiguous friendship. And pilgrimage with as much capacity as Pentecostalism to make us think about degrees of ritual participation, economic as well as physical mobility, and social and political as well as religious transformation. Okay, that's my summary of the book, and thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'd like to invite John to raise some questions and provide some comments.
Yeah, I took the opportunity of sending my comments to Simon so that he didn't feel ambushed.
Thanks, John.
But, yeah, well, it's nothing worse, isn't there? Someone raising enormous issues that you don't have time to consider. So I'll just track what I sent so that I can read them out to the others who weren't part of that conversation. Okay, so in no particular order, and it's up to how Simon responds to this, but I'm sure they may well overlap with other people's points, which I haven't liaised with. I've liaised with Mario, but not with Lena. So the first issue I raised was his use of relationality. In the book, it seems that Simon focuses on relationality, which has become a kind of big buzzword now, hasn't it? In terms of human conscious and unconscious processes. So it's really, the focus is on human beings and people. But what about the more than representational interpretations of relationality, where other than human agency is seen as shaping human action? So I've been working with others on this issue, which challenges my own kind of training, really, which is from a representational perspective, but those working in material religion, particularly, I think, and those actor network theory and other theories have very much argued to reverse the perspective. So So challenging Simon about why does he focus then on relationality in terms of the human conscious and unconscious processes. Secondly, what does he think about many people involved in pilgrimage now, doing pilgrimage, who distance themselves from institutional religion and emphasize spirituality, which is a term, again, which has all kinds of interpretations and meanings. Why focus on the powers of pilgrimage in terms of just religion in post-secular conditions? So you could argue that the title should really be Religion and Spirituality, and just suggesting that as a provocation. Thirdly, why, Simon doesn't come out of the closet, I think, in a way that I've been forced to, I think, by recent work. Why is he so fascinated by pilgrimage personally? So how is this linked to his own identity? Everyone has to now declare their identity. So why is he staying in the shadows, perhaps, as a provocation? And finally, this concerns me, I think, in terms of future pilgrimage studies. Why is pilgrimage studies not found a strong base in the higher education sector in terms of curriculum? So it's still a marginal topic in the anthropology and sociology of religion, for example. So clearly there are some centres like at York and William and Mary with George Grenier, but really, despite all the enormous expansion of the subject, so that we can now call it pilgrimage studies, why is it still avoided by people who work, if you like, in the mainstream of sociology and anthropology of religion? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, John. I'd like to invite Lena now to offer some comments.
I wasn't really sure of the degree of formality of this session. So, well, I've prepared comments and some questions.
Wonderful.
So we'll stick to that. Yeah. So first I have to say thank you for the invitation to the seminar. I'm really honored and very pleased to have this opportunity to discuss Simon's latest book, Powers of Pilgrimage. And I must say that reading it reminds me of the many seminars and conferences during the past 15 years or so, where researchers in the field have discussed this intrigue and entanglement of pilgrimage practices with the most diverse cultural and social forms and phenomena. And I think there are perhaps other people who have participated in the PilNet, but for the rest of you, I will just tell you, like little experiences from the seminar. More than once, I remember that these seminars ended with Simon suggesting that perhaps we could conclude the discussions with a simple exclamation: "What on earth is going on?" And this question, to our amusement, I think it was really significant because it pointed to the enormous complexity and surprising development of the phenomenon. And I think that in itself engages our curiosity, but also to how it has continued to challenge us and grow. So I read this book as a completely brilliant and hugely inspiring answer to that question, showing us how far the field has come, and also offering this whole new theoretical lexicon, urging us both to expand our theoretical frames and be more precise than before in our analysis. I think that's something that Simon stresses in this book, more precise analysis. So I would like to address the broader question of in what direction Simon's theoretical frame takes the field. And of course, as Simon has summarized now, it points to different dialogues and different subfields. But I think we could apply, as I think Simon did too, one of the conceptual paths suggested in the book, enclaving and entraining, to think about the research field itself. The path suggested here is that pilgrimage studies, rather than enclaving, remaining an isolated inward-looking field, should entrain. I think that could be said that is actively seeking to become entangled with wider theoretical fields by means of engaging with them. So there are different fields that pilgrimage can relate to, but in this book, what stands out, and I think what is new, is that the book connects pilgrimage studies to well-known cultural theorists such as Stuart Hall and Anat Singh, and suggesting that articulation theory can do the job that is needed. And I think that Simon is very persuading in suggesting this. It's a well-known theory, but I think it's a brilliant way of presenting how it can be, how articulation can be used as a concept that I'm sure it will be very useful in pilgrimage studies. And my question here is, what about other possible theoretical dialogues in the wider field of studies of religion? And some have been mentioned by Simon. I will not address them. I'm just thinking of, and maybe that has to do with John's question about, the relative marginality of pilgrimage studies in curriculum, for instance. But I think it's clear that pilgrimage theory, as presented and developed here, speaks to a number of topical debate in religious studies on secularity versus religion, on the theoretical turn to religious practice rather than text and institution, a theoretical turn which has been hugely important, for instance, for the study of gender and power in religion and other fields as well as the concepts of enchantment or re-enchantment that now are becoming very popular again. Could the field reach out also in this direction and entrain theorization, so to speak? And my question here is related to a recent concern in my own research on the Lutheran pilgrimage walks in the Church of Sweden, in which I have started exploring the turn to climate action and involvement with transnational climate pilgrimages. This case offers an example of a movement from enclaving to entraining. So here we can very well make use of Simon's lexicon. The ecological turn implies for the Lutheran pilgrimages, leaving the localized pilgrimage walk focused on self-becoming behind, to cross physical and theological borders and merging the pilgrimage walk with the protest march for climate justice. So it's quite similar to examples that Simon presents in the book. And while working on the Lutheran pilgrimage movement and also discussing pilgrimage in these numerous seminars where we have connected pilgrimage to the social, the cultural, the political, and so on, I have gradually felt a need to redirect attention to the religious dimensions of pilgrimage, or the sacred, to use this short term, that somehow often seems to fall out of the picture, at least sometimes in our discussions. I'm not suggesting that powers of pilgrimage excludes that. I think it's more a question of scholarly focus of what Simon calls the politics of attention. One way of paying attention to the sacred in terms of articulation would be to shift focus from articulations of pilgrimage with mundane practices or everyday life to a search for the sacred in the mundane, so to speak. And that is just like a suggestion of mine. In the case of articulations of pilgrimage with a new cycle of environmental movements, this would imply asking, what are the religious or ritual dimensions of these movements, and how can they illuminate contemporary transformations of pilgrimage? So this is what Simon's discussion also has inspired me to address today. But I guess my question to Simon here is simply if you can relate to this vague sense of a loss of religion, perhaps, in our discussions of pilgrimage. And if you could comment on this somehow elusive concept of the sacred and how you see how you look upon its place in pilgrimage studies.
Hey, thank you very much. Very interesting avenues to go down. So Mario, I'd like to invite you to offer some comments, and then Simon will respond.
First of all, thank you for inviting me to participate on this very interesting event, and thank you, Simon, for producing the book that we can discuss now. I will not be a gentle critic. I will be will be praising the author of the book, but of course I also have some of the questions that I find very interesting, and I would like to discuss, not just with the author but also with all the participants here. The book Powers of Pilgrimage is, I would say, a very timely event. Every decade since 1970s, there are publications within very broad and this interdisciplinary field of pilgrimage studies that inspire pilgrimage scholars for years. And we needed that, I would say, in 2020s. And I consider this book as the book that will give new momentum to the field. Of course, Simon Coleman is not a new name in the pilgrimage studies. Over the last decades, he has produced many edited volumes, papers, lectures that already had a huge impact. However, this book is exactly what we needed him to do, to draw out his main road in pilgrimage research and to give his reflections on the main concepts, main questions, main issues of pilgrimage studies in general. I said it was a timely event, and I said this mostly because of one particular aspect of the book that I personally find and consider of utmost importance, and that is methodological questions of researching pilgrimage. Finally, I think we have on one place, written by one of the contemporary biggest names in pilgrimage studies, the outline of different methodological approaches to pilgrimage, main problems, main challenges, but also some possible solutions. Finally, someone wrote the question that I find the most important of pilgrimage studies is precisely where and how to focus our attention. And of course, since methodology cannot be separated from theoretical conceptualizations, Simon stamped one more very important question of pilgrimage studies, and that is that we should avoid putting, as he writes, pilgrimage-related activities into very narrow boxes. I personally know that young scholars who are entering the field have problems with reviewers, with project proposals, with PhDs, when they have to explain why they approach or consider some practice as pilgrimage. Usually scholars have very narrow understanding of pilgrimage, and it is very hard to argue your ideas. But however, I think with this book in your hand, many discussions will be won. And here I also come to my questions. Based on this book and a contemporary state of research in pilgrimage studies, I was considering, is one case, one book, or one case, one paper approach to pilgrimage good enough anymore? Or are we looking at a new direction in researching pilgrimage? Of course, this is not new. I mean, people are obviously approach pilgrimage using many sites and different approaches. However, it seems that even now, scholars researching pilgrimage are still focusing on only one site. I'm asking this because Simon himself wrote that in order to conceptualize the main ideas of his book, the multiple articulations of pilgrimage, he had to move from focusing on a single site. Recently, we also had a special issue of Journal of Global Catholicism where scholars discussed multi-sited ethnographies of pilgrimage. But of course, in several papers and volumes, Simon has already addressed multi-locality approach already. Just to be clear, when I say multi-local, I'm not referring here to only physicality of site, but to movement in general, following the articulations of your research problems, which becomes very important, as Simon highlighted in this book, especially in this contemporary interconnected world, where tracking the dynamic formation of pilgrimage is most affected by comparative analysis that goes beyond a single site. But I'm thinking how that works together with the concepts that Simon involved in this book and took on, penumbra and laterality. And that seems to be connected again to the main question of pilgrimage studies methodology that Simon drew out, and I already mentioned, and that's precisely where and how to focus one's attention. So I hope we'll be able to discuss these methodological issues that Simon raised in his book.
Hey, thank you, Mario. So Simon, a lot there to respond to. I invite you to briefly engage some of the questions, and then we can move forward to even broader discussion.
Thank you so much for those questions. There's obviously, I'm not going to do any of them justice, actually, but they're hugely, I think, important for me. I'm going to just try and pick up on a number of those themes, and I'm going to do it very quickly. John, the question of the other than human and non-representationality, in a sense, haunts my book to a certain degree. But I think one of the reasons why it haunts it is that I see it in a certain sense as being there, but not obviously there. So I use a slightly different vocabulary in the book, trying to think about questions actually of, for instance, of affordance, of thinking about objects in physical spaces that I see as contributing to but not determining the actions of pilgrims. And actually I see some of my spatial vocabulary trying to talk about things like adjacency, penumbra, actually tight and loose spaces, which I get from urban geographical theory. I actually see that as helping to contribute to trying to think about the relationship between non-human agency and human agency, but I suspect I don't actually bring that out nearly enough in the book, to be honest. So I think you're actually pointing to, in a sense, a connection which I don't make obvious enough. Although there's a small part of the book where I talk about more than representational approaches with regard to the work of Richard Scriven and Mahoney as well, but there's not enough there. But I would see it as being there, but not kind of explicitly there. In terms of pilgrimage and going beyond the post-secular, I think one of the things I'd say about that is that it's important for me in the book that actually I'm also talking about pilgrimage in certain contexts where the post-secular becomes almost kind of irrelevant as a term. So this is where I, for instance, use the work of Anne Gold and Rajasthani pilgrims, where these kind of concerns about the post-secular simply are not relevant to the people that she talks about. But you're also, of course, making this important point about why don't I actually go further into looking at some of those post-secular contexts and extending what I say about pilgrimage. I don't actually have a particularly good answer to that, other than to say I actually wanted to stick to what I saw as some of the kind of main debates within the field. I didn't want it to get into a kind of secular versus non-secular debate. And in many ways, the book is actually ultimately about questions of articulation. You could almost take pilgrimage away from it and say that the underlying theoretical question is actually about connectivity and articulation. Pilgrimage becomes one version of looking at that. There's much more to say about that. Sorry, I can't do it justice. Why am I fascinated with pilgrimage? Well, we can possibly ask Freud about that. But one answer to that question is actually that, if you like, my conversion experience to pilgrimage, I think to some degree, I can trace to going to Walsingham and going to this place that I knew nothing about, wandering into the shrine and seeing actually an image that made me think, what on earth is happening here? Of course, what I was doing is I was doing that in the context of having spent years studying Pentecostalism. So actually, I see it personally, actually, in terms of a particular kind of aesthetic response, a physical response, as well as an intellectual response to these two fields, which actually I physically felt at the time as being utterly remote from each other. So I think there is a kind of personal as well as a kind of intellectual and indeed a field-based response to that question. Why hasn't pilgrimage studies found a strong base in the higher education sector? It seems to me that there are a number of answers to that question. I mean, you can look at, for instance, lots of discussions of the history of geography, which actually talks about how geographers, for instance, don't want to talk about the religion. It's seen as being a kind of research-killing kind of activity. In the context of the argument of the book, of course, one of the things I'm arguing there is that, ironically, in a certain sense, the kind of Turnerian emphasis has actually disempowered pilgrimage studies, and actually, in a sense, it's appeared to sever those connections with things like mobility and landscape, and even things like gender and enchantment, which actually are all there, but which actually I think that some of the theoretical thrust has taken away from the field. Very, very quickly, also to talk about Lena's, I think, wonderful comments there. Yes, you're precisely right. This book is absolutely an intent to entrain pilgrimage to other fields. And it is also absolutely an attempt to do that in a generative way. So if in a certain sense, I see, for instance, images of liminality and communities as having enclaved pilgrimage, what I'm attempting to do is to create a theoretical perspective that precisely allows you to go and run with it. You can run with it in many different directions. I happen to choose certain directions, but it seems to me that, for instance, questions of gender, secularity, and so on are all absolutely open. And I love the way in which you're showing us some of the ways in which that can occur. If we want to try and go back to questions of religion and the sacred, I'm not going to be able to answer that satisfactorily at the moment, other than to say that the back of my mind in writing the book and in stuff that I actually want to write in the future in relation to all this is that I'm interested in trying to think about what might be meant by a kind of pilgrimage ethic in relation to activities that appear to be secular. And obviously deliberately kind of echoing Weber here, but the ways in which one can use certain kind of pilgrimage tropes to create what I think of at the moment as a kind of degree of seriousness or earnestness in relation to what one does, which gives a kind of, if you want to call it a sacralizing ethic around one's activity. But it seems to me that this is again a kind of generative outward way of thinking about pilgrimage tropes. Mario, I'm so glad that among other things, you talked about methodology there. And actually one of the things, again, I'm trying to do at the moment in field work I'm doing at the moment at Walsingham, but also implicit in this book, is to say, if we're expanding our understanding of pilgrimage, we are not just going to single shrines for a start. And here I have to say that Mark Lustow was absolutely key to me in writing about kind of a singularist emphasis in a lot of pilgrimage studies. But of course, we're also going beyond the journey. We're also going beyond fetishized ideas of the home. We're actually thinking about the ways in which pilgrimage sites relate to each other, to other kinds of sites, to other kinds of institutions. So in the work I'm doing at the moment at Walsingham, I'm working on a site in North Norfolk, but I'm traveling around Britain actually as a way of looking at instantiations of what Walsingham might mean. It seems to me this actually, and of course relating Walsingham to Lourdes and to Knock and to other places as well. So it seems we actually have to explode what we understand by our methodologies in thinking about pilgrimage. And finally, I'm going to make a comment that I think links Mario and Lena a bit, which is to talk about these question of focusing attention. And one of the messages I'm trying to say in the book is that we can have a vocabulary that attempts to describe apparent fuzziness of activity and the breaking down of boundaries and porosities of both places and rituals. These are all extremely, if you like, challenging to us because they appear to be deeply fuzzy and boundary breaking. That doesn't stop us from attempting to be precise analytically in looking at those fuzzy spaces. And that's the great challenge. You're looking at things which are endlessly diffusing, but you're attempting to create a vocabulary that allows you to look at that in more precise analytical and comparative terms. So those are my quick responses. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you, Simon. So I'd like to open things up for further discussion, and I would just ask people to raise their hand either physically or virtually. And so we can continue our examination of Simon's work. Well, I will ask this because I was particularly taken with your understanding of pilgrimage, and you're being drawn to it as in part aesthetic. Could you talk a little more about that, and particularly how that might relate to the kinds of theoretical stances you take in relation to pilgrimage as a phenomenon?
Yes, I think there's at the back of that question of the aesthetic, one of the ways in which to take that is, of course, I'm wrestling with the long debate in the anthropology of Christianity, but also much further, which is how does the apparently in inverted commas secular observer engage with pilgrimage shrines and pilgrimage activities? And one of the things that I try and argue is that in my work on both Pentecostalism and pilgrimage, it seems to me actually, if one goes away from certain kinds of theological perspectives, but there are certain ways in which you can understand secular observers as participating in rituals in ways which go beyond the purely cognitive or intellectual, and which actually involve them through effective and aesthetic ways, which actually do create certain kind of, if you like, ways in which they participate in ritual as powerfully as engaged ways as people who would see themselves as, if you like, pious pilgrims or self-identify themselves as religious. So I call this aesthetic participation. There's a sense in which it's, one talks about participant observation, but this is a kind of aesthetic participation, where there's a sense in which one can become involved in these ritual forms. Now, those involvements, of course, can involve patterns of recognition. And to give I gave that candle example. Is the candle celebrating a saint, or is it celebrating a birthday? So there are I see these in a certain sense as being aesthetic bridges, almost forms of kind of bridges of habitus, where you can see connections between what one does in other areas of one's life and what actually might be going on at a pilgrimage site. The question is, what do we make of these? Do we see them as being trivial? Do we see them as being not really religious and therefore things that we shouldn't be looking at? But of course, the thrust of the book is to say these are precisely other forms of engagement and entrainment, if you like, which bring people into the rhythm and the look of activities. And they're often seen as being marginal. But a place like Walsingham, where I study, it's actually those kinds of engagements, which are often apparently very trivial, apparently very passing, but which are nonetheless almost kind of the predominant forms of engagement with what's going on at a site like that, in terms of numbers of people who are there. What do we do with that? So it seems to me that the aesthetic becomes a particular kind of bridge into forms of engagement. And here I'm also thinking about the work of people like Birgit Meyer, who talks about notions of sensational form. I mean, she's quite influenced by Durkheim in using that vocabulary, but the sense in which these forms themselves become bridges between observers and activities in rituals. So the aesthetic there becomes a way to bridge, if you like, common debates between outsiders and insiders.
Okay, thank you. Anyone would like to put Simon on the spot? Yeah, John.
Well, it's really tracking back to the abiding power of the Turnerian paradigm, you know, because
Yes,
it's a bit like Punch and Judy. How many times can you knock the person down? They just spring up again. So I was really thinking more recently about how this reflects a long abiding cultural tradition going back to the 19th century Romantic movement. I'm particularly interested in music because, as you know, I sing a lot, and so I've been reading this massive tome on the Romantic movement in the 19th century, and it just struck me as explaining a lot about the abiding power of the Turnerian, you know, this idea that we escape society and we go up a mountain, you know, the famous 19th century, you know, portrait, you know, by the guy, the German guy, where he stands on top of the mountain, he's master of the universe kind of thing. So in a way, I think we need a kind of more embedding of these kind of academic discourses in a wider cultural history, I think. And I think I also link it to understanding the Camino in terms of the in terms of Hollywood and the abiding power of the road movie, you know, because again, this notion that you can take off, you know, and Jack Kerouac, you know, on the road, blah blah blah. You know, you leave your hometown, you're out there on the road. So I think there are some very fascinating areas of cultural and popular history that are still important to explaining this abiding power of the image.
I think, yeah, those are very powerful points. I agree. I think they're very powerful points. I think I'm very glad you mentioned the kind of Punch and Judy point, because, you know, a lot of people, I think, might say, of course, to me, why on earth do you even have a chapter on the Turners? You know, there's a, you know, what can be said about them that hasn't been said? Well, of course, I think there are things to be said, and I try and talk about some of the kind of background there. But part of my point is precisely the one that you're making there, John, which is that you keep knocking them down, but they keep coming back up. And so you can't ignore that. You can't simply say, oh, look, you know, it's all old hat. You have to explain why it is that they keep coming up. What is it about them that makes them so powerful? And there are various ways in which to kind of respond to that. And I, of course, in the book, I try and to talk a little bit about how the very idea of communitas itself is, like, as I put it, a kind of trope that's made to travel across different kind of cultural forms. But it seems to me also that, of course, you can relate some of what they're saying to a number of different kind of significant, I think, a much broader cultural tropes. And in terms of the Romantic movement, I mean, it'd be interesting, of course, to think about Van Gennep writing precisely at the cusp of, you know, the 19th and 20th centuries, writing in the light of those Romantic movements, which are also influencing Durkheim. Van Gennep is in a kind of uneasy debate with Durkheim. And this is precisely a kind of wider cultural history that one has to understand, I think, if you're looking at the kind of deeper resonance there. Just by the way, if how can one understand, I would argue, Image and Pilgrimage without thinking about also, I would say, Vatican II, and thinking about the ways in which the Turners are also looking at actually charismatic movements. I think there are all sorts of ways in which there are these kind of wider questions, which means that they are plugging into these kind of wider cultural themes. The irony of that, I would argue, is that communitas and liminality simultaneously become ultra diffused, and I would argue that they actually close down to some degree debate on what pilgrimage can be about. And with regard to the Camino, actually, one part of my argument is that in a certain sense, I think something similar is happening. Camino becomes both a place, or sorry, if you like, a location, a route, but it also becomes a trope that actually becomes, if you like, good pilgrimage. It becomes attractive even to secular analysts of pilgrimage. So it's okay to go on the Camino, even if you're not a self-identified kind of religionist or believer. So the Camino itself becomes, if you like, a kind of comfortable analytical as well as ethnographic form into which people can place themselves, and which, hey presto, you come to see as emerging and being the most significant trope within pilgrimage. I don't think it is necessarily. I think it's highly important, but of course there are many other ways to think about pilgrimage, and we also have to think about Camino itself as being a manifestation of wider cultural themes. Camino is not an analytical endpoint in itself. It is an instantiation, precisely those wider cultural themes, which is what we should be looking at here, I think. So I absolutely agree in both of your points there.
Excellent. Mark Lousteau.
Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you so much to Matt and Tom for convening this Author Meets Critic session. And thanks, Simon, for the shout out at the beginning of the presentation. I wanted to ask you, given the context of this session hosted by the Journal of Global Catholicism, I wanted to ask you, to what extent do you see this aesthetic bridging function as Catholic? And I sort of here I'm kind of pointing you back to an essay that you wrote, which I believe was titled "We're All Catholic Now," which explored the idea that rather than we're all Protestant now, that there's sort of a global Protestant cultural formation that has seeped into all sorts of different secular and cultural phenomenon, that in fact Catholicism has played that role. And so I'm wondering if some of the theoretical points or social processes that you're identifying here are actually Catholic. And then, I mean, the answer to that question might very well be no. So I don't want to push you in a certain direction, again, given the context of this session being hosted by the Journal of Global Catholicism, but I am very curious to know what your answer is.
Yes, I think of course, that essay was in the back of my mind, and the kind of ideas behind that essay, "We're All Catholics Now," is precisely some of those themes were in the back of my mind as I was writing this book. So that's a very good catch. Well identified, Mark. And I think the point is that if you see this book as being a dialogue about between Pentecostalism and pilgrimage, there's a certain sense in which one of the arguments that keys into, not the only arguments that keys into, but it does key into that anthropology of Christianity almost kind of regime of beginning to kind of think about the Protestant subject, starting to think about notions of both subject and wrestling with materiality and forms of language, which become part of a kind of, I would argue, of a kind of Protestantization or a Pentecostalization of the early years of the anthropology of Christianity. So everything becomes a kind of wrestling with trying to escape from materiality. I'm kind of summarizing it extremely crudely, but you know what I mean. There's a certain sense in which that becomes a kind of certain thrust, and that then becomes located in certain debates about modernity and so on, and anthropological approaches to modernity. And of course, what I'm trying to argue here is that is in part to say that the kind of the pilgrimage, the image of pilgrimage in my terms, not in the Turnerian terms, but the image of pilgrimage is a way of taking us back from thinking about materiality as being a problem that the human subject must remove themselves from. And it's precisely a way of trying to think through those forms of materiality in other kinds of ways, which actually, by the way, links back a little bit to some of what John is saying about the kind of more going beyond kind of representational attitude towards the material. So, so part of that debate is to say, actually, you can key the kind of Pentecostalism pilgrimage debate into what I see as a debate about the relationship between a kind of Protestantized and non-Protestantized understanding of Christianity. But it's also, of course, I'm not attempting, although I would argue that, of course, I'm influenced by studies of Catholicism, it seems to me that I'm also trying to say, going beyond simply saying that the kind of pilgrimage engagement with the material and the affordances of the material that I'm describing has to be seen only through a kind of Catholic genealogy. It seems to me that there are kind of wider genealogies there that you can see in the ethnographic record. And I use Angold, if you like, as was one of my representatives of that attitude, where we actually have to go beyond this kind of domination of a certain kind of notion of the Protestant subject, which itself is highly problematic, by the way. If you like, there's another kind of mini genealogy here, which is that I'm also writing as a scholar, not just of Pentecostalism, but actually of prosperity Christianity. The most, what appears to be the most deeply material form of what is seen as the Pentecostal. So there's a kind of, for me, there's a kind of return of the material through a lot of what I'm trying to write here, and indeed a kind of reformation of what the Protestant subject, what the pilgrim as subject might be. And this also, by the way, I'm just going to say this very, very briefly. This also, this is kind of a little bit in the book, not described very much. This also feeds into current debates about notions of porosity of the subject, which themselves also, of course, go back to people like Charles Taylor. So there's a kind of other kind of genealogy, Charles Taylor, of course, coming from a kind of Catholic philosophical viewpoint. But there are all of those kind of genealogies there, which are often alluded to only very briefly in the book, but which, you know, my publishers told me, you know, you've got to cut and cut and cut. But all of that stuff, or some of that stuff, had to be taken out. But you're absolutely right in identifying, I think, some of those themes.
Well, for our last question, I'll turn to Jackie Feldman to conclude our session.
Thank you very much, Simon, and to all of you. Simon, I want to ask you, what role do you see in what you've been speaking of until now, and what I've seen beginning of the book? I haven't read it yet. For the older themes, but which I see is very much still prevalent, perhaps because I'm sitting here in Jerusalem and looking at these Temple Mount movement, and of the pilgrimage as a manifestation of presence, as something that is almost, you know, designed to close ranks, to make ideas real, and to arouse political hostility. Where does that play into the different theoretical perspectives you're bringing?
I think, yeah, it's a great question. It seems to me that a number of different ways to think about that. One of the ways to think about that is, for instance, you'll see later on in the book, in I think the penultimate chapter of the book, is when I actually start to talk. And by the way, your work features, as you'll discover, Jackie, later on in the book as well. There are also ways in which in that penultimate chapter of the book, one of the things I'm trying to do is to talk about the relationship between, if you like, pilgrimage movement and formations of presence, and political action and processions, and things like processions and engagement in public space, including urban space. So one of the things that I become interested in there is the ways in which the kind of pilgrimage I'm describing there is not just a manifestation of presence, it's a manifestation of visible presence, which actually engages with other institutional and political forms. So on the one hand, you can see a site like Walsingham that I'm studying as being way out in Norfolk, and it has its own kind of political forms, but who notices? But on the other hand, you can actually see some of the kind of pilgrimage engagement with Chicago or movements between Mexico and New York that I describe as being ways actually of creating and entraining a political presence that is using the idiom of pilgrimage and movement across boundaries to create, if you like, frictions and visible frictions with other institutions and other political and indeed religious forms in public space. And this, it seems to me, to be an absolutely central part of how we should be thinking about pilgrimage. And indeed, it's the way in which pilgrimage has been used in the past as well, which it seems to me is not, but and yet has not been actually given enough visibility in the literatures. I think there are also, just to take this back in another way, I think you can also see if you take this theme of articulation, one of the things that I think one can also do in relation to the kind of theoretical approach of the book is to see how pilgrimage as ostensible religious form can become articulated with other institutional forms that themselves have political engagements. And so actually we don't see pilgrimage there as being separate from, but we see it actually as combining with other institutional forms. This becomes, if you like, a kind of assemblage. I prefer the word articulation, so that pilgrimage is not isolated, it becomes part of a wider network of activity. And I would just give you an example of what I mean here. The connection between what goes on in North Norfolk in this tiny shrine and a demonstration in London against abortion. It seems to me that we actually have to understand these two as being together. There are, if you like, there are presences of people who are in these two groups, but there are also ways in which these two apparently different activities are feeding into each other and must be understood in relation to each other.
Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Well, our conversation has been all too brief, but on behalf of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, the Journal of Global Catholicism, I'd like to thank all of you, particularly Simon Coleman, Mario Katic, Lena Gemzoe, and John Eade. And thank you all for being present here today. And we hope that the discussion in a variety of other contexts can continue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Very enjoyable.
Thank you very much. And thanks to everybody who's here and for all the
Thank
questions.
you all.
Thank you.